Hill 205 was not supposed to matter. On most maps, it was nothing more than a contour line, a low rise overlooking a stretch of broken ground somewhere in Western Europe in 1944. No town, no road junction worth mentioning, no name painted on signposts, just a number given by artillery officers who never expected anyone to fight for it. But on one cold morning, 23 American soldiers were ordered to take it and hold it. They were not an elite unit, they were not reinforced, they were not prepared for what was coming. Their orders were simple and dangerously vague: secure the hill and maintain position until relieved. Relief never came. As they climbed the slope, the men quickly understood why the hill had been ignored for so long. The ground was exposed, scarred by shell craters and stripped of heavy cover. A few trees clung to the slope, shattered and splintered. From the top, the view was wide and unforgiving: open fields below, hedgerows in the distance, and shallow depressions where an enemy could move unseen. It was a perfect killing ground. By mid-morning, they were in position. They dug shallow foxholes with frozen hands, scraping at earth that resisted every strike. Ammunition was checked and rechecked, rifles cleaned, machine gun positioned to cover the approaches. The men spoke quietly, conserving energy, conserving focus. None of them said what everyone was already thinking: if the enemy came in force, this hill would become a trap. The first signs arrived shortly after noon: movement in the fields below, distant figures, the unmistakable sound of German mortars being set up. Then the shelling began. Explosions ripped into the slope, throwing dirt and shrapnel through the air. Foxholes shook. Men pressed deeper into the ground, helmets pulled low, teeth clenched. The bombardment wasn't heavy, not yet, but it was precise. Someone down there knew exactly where Hill 205 was, and they wanted it cleared. When the shelling stopped, silence followed. That silence was worse. The Americans scanned the fields, rifles steady, hearts pounding. Wind moved through broken grass. Smoke drifted lazily upward. Then figures emerged: German infantry advancing in small groups, using the terrain intelligently, spreading out, probing. The 23 opened fire. Rifles cracked in sharp bursts. The machine gun roared, cutting across the slope. The first wave stumbled and dropped, survivors pulling back into cover. For a brief moment it worked. The hill held. But the Germans did not leave. They regrouped. More movement appeared. Mortars fired again, closer this time. Shrapnel tore into the shallow earthworks. One man screamed and went silent. Another crawled back, blood soaking his sleeve. The hill was already taking its toll. Radio calls went unanswered. Static. Nothing else. The platoon leader tried again and again to reach command, to report contact, to request reinforcements or permission to fall back. There was no response. Somewhere beyond the smoke and noise, the battle had shifted, lines had moved, and Hill 205 had slipped through the cracks. By late afternoon, it was clear. They were alone. German infantry attacked again, this time more aggressively, pushing closer, testing every angle. The Americans fired until barrels overheated, passing ammunition hand to hand. Orders were shouted, then whispered. The wounded stayed where they fell, refusing evacuation that did not exist. As the sun dipped lower, the slope in front of Hill 205 was littered with bodies and abandoned equipment. The Germans pulled back once more, not defeated, just delayed. The 23 Americans counted themselves. They were already fewer. No one said how many attacks might come next. No one asked when relief would arrive. They understood something instinctively now. This hill mattered, not because of what it was, but because of what would happen if they lost it. As night began to fall, the men of Hill 205 tightened their grip on rifles, checked their remaining ammunition, and prepared for the next assault. They had taken the hill. Now they would have to hold it against an enemy who was not done, against darkness, against exhaustion, and against the growing realization that this position might become their last stand, and the worst part was still ahead. Night changed everything. As darkness settled over Hill 205, the battlefield shrank. What had been open ground in daylight became a maze of shadows, shell craters, and unseen movement. Visibility dropped to a few dozen meters. Sounds carried strangely. A footstep downhill could sound like it was right beside you, while voices nearby seemed to vanish into the wind. The 23 Americans adjusted instinctively. Fields of fire were shortened, flares were rationed. The machine gun was shifted slightly to cover the most likely approach routes, its crew rotating positions to stay awake. No one slept. They leaned into their foxholes, rifles resting on frozen earth, eyes fixed on darkness that felt alive. German mortars returned just after midnight. This time they walked the rounds up the slope methodically, probing for weak points. Explosions burst closer and closer, collapsing shallow foxholes, filling them with dirt and fragments. One position went silent after a direct hit. When the firing stopped, no one could reach it. The hill was already claiming men it would not give back. Then came the infantry. They did not charge, they crept. Small groups moved uphill, slow and deliberate, using shell holes and folds in the ground. The Germans knew this hill now. They had studied it. They were testing the Americans, forcing them to fire, counting shots, learning where the defenders were strongest and where they were thin. The Americans waited as long as they dared. When the Germans crossed an invisible line, rifles cracked in the dark. Muzzle flashes tore holes in the night. The machine gun opened up, sweeping the slope in short bursts to avoid overheating. Figures dropped. Others crawled back. Grenades arced upward, exploding just short of the line. The attack broke, but only just. A runner crawled along the American positions, passing whispered updates. Ammunition was down to what each man carried. Medical supplies were almost gone. 2 more wounded lay in foxholes, patched with torn cloth and field dressings that would not last the night. The radio was tried again. Nothing. No acknowledgement, no orders, no reassurance. The platoon leader gathered the remaining men in a shallow depression, keeping their heads below the skyline. His voice was calm, controlled, the way it had to be. They would hold. They would not fire unless necessary. They would conserve everything. No one argued. By early morning, fog rolled in, thick and cold, clinging to the slope like a second skin. It muffled sound and erased distance. The hill felt smaller now, tighter, as if the world had closed around it. German voices drifted up through the mist, close, too close. Boots crunched, metal clinked. Someone laughed briefly, confident. The Americans did not move. Fingers tightened on triggers. Breathing slowed. Men stared into fog so dense it felt solid. Then a flare hissed upward. White light burst above Hill 205, freezing everything in place. For a heartbeat, the defenders were exposed. Foxholes, shattered trees, bodies where they had fallen. German shouts followed immediately. Weapons snapped into action. The second assault hit hard. This time the Germans came faster, pushing uphill through smoke and fog, firing as they advanced. The Americans answered with everything they had left. Rifles emptied, grenades exploded at close range. The machine gun roared until its barrel smoked, then fell silent as ammunition ran out. The fight collapsed into chaos. Men fired point blank from foxholes. Others fought from craters, dragging the wounded down with them. Orders were no longer shouted. They were felt, passed by movement and instinct. When it ended, the fog swallowed the slope again. German survivors pulled back once more, leaving the hill quiet except for the wounded and dying. Hill 205 still stood, but barely. As dawn approached, the defenders took stock. They were no longer 23. Ammunition was dangerously low. The wounded outnumbered the able-bodied. and the enemy had learned exactly how thin the line really was. Hill 205 had survived the night, but the men holding it understood the truth with brutal clarity. Daylight would bring another attack, and the next one would not be a probe. It would be an attempt to erase them completely. Daylight returned without mercy. As the fog thinned and the first pale light washed over Hill 205, the damage became impossible to ignore. Foxholes were half collapsed, trees were splintered stumps. The ground was torn open and blackened by explosions. Bodies lay where they had fallen, American and German, frozen into the slope like part of the terrain itself. The men who could still stand checked weapons in silence. Some rifles no longer worked. Some hands shook too badly to load properly. Some men were still alive only because they refused to lie down. The platoon leader counted again. They were down to 17. No relief had arrived. No message had come through. No sign suggested that anyone even knew they were still there. Below the hill, German movement increased. Infantry units repositioned openly now, no longer hiding their intentions. Mortar teams were set up with clear lines of fire. Officers moved along the slope, pointing, gesturing, organizing. This was no longer harassment or probing. This was preparation. The Americans understood exactly what that meant. They redistributed ammunition, taking rounds from the dead and wounded. Grenades were counted, only a few left. The machine gun crew stripped what they could from the weapon, salvaging belts, knowing the gun itself might not fire again. Medical supplies were gone. Morphine was gone. Bandages were rags. When the first shells landed, they were heavier than before. Mortars hammered the hill with deliberate accuracy, walking fire from one end to the other, collapsing positions one by one. Men were forced out of foxholes and into craters, clinging to whatever cover remained. Dirt filled mouths. Ears rang. The hill shook as if it were being broken apart piece by piece. Then the shelling stopped. German infantry rose from cover and advanced in strength. Not small groups this time, not cautious movement, a full assault. They came uphill shouting, firing as they moved, using smoke to blind what little visibility the defenders still had. The Americans waited until the enemy was close, closer than doctrine allowed, because ammunition could not be wasted. Then they opened fire. Rifles cracked in controlled bursts, grenades exploded among advancing figures. The hill became a wall of noise and smoke. Germans fell, others stepped over them and kept coming. The Americans fired until rifles clicked empty, then grabbed another weapon, another magazine, anything that worked. The line bent. It did not break. A German squad reached the crest on the eastern side. For a moment, it looked like the hill was lost. An American corporal charged out of his crater, firing from the hip, forcing the enemy back at point-blank range before collapsing from a wound he hadn't noticed yet. The fight became personal. Men shouted warnings instead of orders. Ammunition was thrown by hand. The wounded fired from the ground. No one thought about survival, only about holding for a few seconds longer. When the Germans finally pulled back, the slope was silent again. Smoke drifted. Wind moved through broken grass. The hill still belonged to the Americans, but only barely. They counted again. 14. Some were wounded badly. Some could no longer move. None were untouched. The platoon leader tried the radio one more time. Static. He looked at the men around him, dirty, bleeding, exhausted, still gripping weapons, and understood what Hill 205 had become. It was no longer a position to be held until relieved. It was a position that would be held until there was no one left to hold it. Below them, German units reorganized again, patient, methodical, confident that the hill would eventually fall. The Americans used the brief lull to prepare. Foxholes were reinforced with bodies and equipment. Firing lanes were adjusted for the last time. Ammunition was divided evenly, not fairly, but deliberately. Each man would get the same chance to fight. As the sun climbed higher and the sounds of preparation rose once more from below, the men of Hill 205 settled into their positions. They knew the next assault would be worse. They knew it might be the last, but they also knew something the enemy did not. Hill 205 was no longer just ground, it was a promise. And as long as even one American remained alive on that slope, the hill would not be taken without a price the enemy would never forget. By mid-afternoon, Hill 205 had become a place the living were not meant to stay. The sun exposed everything the night had hidden: shattered foxholes, burned patches of earth, bodies lying in unnatural positions where they had fallen hours earlier. The hill smelled of smoke, dirt, and blood soaked deep into frozen ground. There was no cover left that had not already been tested by fire. The Americans were down to 14, and only 9 could still fight. The rest stayed where they were, wounded but conscious, refusing to be moved. Rifles were propped beside them. Ammunition was stacked within reach. If the Germans reached the crest again, even the wounded would fire. Below the hill, the enemy prepared carefully. This time there was no rush, no shouting. German officers moved deliberately among their men, pointing out American positions now clearly visible in daylight. Mortar crews adjusted angles with precision. Machine guns were set to cover the crest from multiple directions. They had learned. The bombardment began again, heavier, closer, relentless. Shells slammed into the hill in tight patterns, tearing apart what little protection remained. The ground heaved. Foxholes collapsed completely. One American was buried to his chest and had to be dug out by hand while the shelling continued. Another lost his hearing entirely, eyes wide, blood running from his ears, still gripping his rifle. When the mortars finally lifted, there was no silence. Machine guns opened from below, sweeping the crest, forcing the defenders to stay down as German infantry began their advance. This was not a test. It was an execution attempt. The platoon leader waited. He let them come close, too close. When the Germans reached the final stretch of open ground, the Americans rose as one and opened fire. Rifles cracked until barrels smoked. Grenades detonated among tightly packed ranks. A wounded soldier fired a captured German weapon from his crater, emptying it without pause. The assault stalled, but only briefly. More Germans poured forward, climbing over their own dead, pushing toward the crest with numbers the Americans could no longer match. Ammunition ran dangerously low. Men counted rounds between bursts. Some fired single shots, aiming carefully, refusing to waste anything. A German machine gun reached a position just below the hill and opened fire at point-blank range. The crest erupted. 2 Americans went down instantly. Another crawled forward with his last grenade and threw it blindly downhill. The explosion silenced the gun, but the man did not get back up. The line bent again. This time it nearly broke. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted along part of the crest. Rifle butts, knives, shouts that dissolved into raw sound. A German soldier reached an American foxhole and was pulled inside. Only one came out. When the Germans finally pulled back, it was not because they had failed. It was because they had lost enough men, for now. The hill was quiet again, except for labored breathing and the low moans of the wounded. Smoke drifted lazily across ground that no longer resembled a hill at all. The platoon leader counted. 10 Americans remained capable of holding weapons. He did not tell the others how bad it was. They already knew. They redistributed the last ammunition. 1 magazine per man. A handful of grenades total. No medical supplies. No radio. No hope of reinforcement. Below them, the Germans regrouped once more, calm, patient, confident. The Americans used the time to prepare in silence. They adjusted positions for the final time. They pulled weapons from the fallen. They checked each other's gear without speaking. No speeches were given. None were needed. Hill 205 had taken everything already. As the shadows lengthened and German units began forming for what would clearly be the final assault, the men remaining on the hill settled into their positions. They understood the truth now. They were not holding Hill 205 for orders. They were not holding it for relief. They were holding it because they were still there, and as long as even one of them remained alive, the hill would not fall easily. The enemy would have to take it, inch by inch, body by body, from men who had already decided they were not leaving. The final assault began without warning. There was no preparatory shelling this time, no probing fire, no gradual buildup. The Germans had learned enough. They knew where the Americans were. They knew how few remained. And they knew the hill could only be taken one way now, by overwhelming what was left. They came in waves. Machine guns opened from multiple positions below the crest, pinning the defenders down while infantry advanced in tight formations behind smoke. The slope disappeared beneath a rolling gray curtain, turning distance into guesswork and sound into confusion. Orders were shouted in German, overlapping, urgent, confident. The Americans waited. They did not fire at shadows. They did not fire at noise. They fired only when shapes became real. The first wave reached the lower slope and began climbing fast, using shell holes and bodies for cover. The Americans rose from what remained of their positions and opened fire with discipline that bordered on defiance. Every shot mattered now. Every round was aimed. Men fired, shifted position, fired again, never staying still long enough to be targeted. 2 Germans reached the crest and were cut down at point-blank range. A third followed and fell into a crater, wounded but alive. No one had time to deal with him. The second wave hit harder. Grenades exploded across the crest, shredding what little cover remained. One American was thrown backward by the blast and did not get up. Another lost his rifle and picked up a fallen weapon without breaking rhythm. Smoke, dirt, and fragments filled the air. The hill itself seemed to be coming apart. A German squad broke through on the western side. For a moment, Hill 205 was split. Fighting collapsed into chaos. Men firing from a few meters apart, shouting warnings instead of commands, dragging wounded out of the line while still shooting. An American sergeant charged forward with his last magazine, forcing the Germans back long enough for the line to close again. It cost him his life. The assault slowed, but it did not stop. The Germans kept coming, stepping over their own dead, pushing forward with numbers the Americans could no longer counter. Ammunition ran dry. Rifles clicked empty. Men searched fallen bodies for usable magazines, for grenades, for anything that could still fire. By now, only 6 Americans were still able to fight. They regrouped instinctively near the center of the crest, backs to one another, covering the last approaches. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Their faces were blackened with smoke and dirt, eyes burning with exhaustion and resolve. When the Germans surged one last time, the Americans met them with everything they had left: single shots, captured weapons, grenades thrown without looking. One by one, the defenders fell, not retreating, not surrendering, still fighting. When it was over, the hill went silent. German soldiers moved cautiously onto the crest, expecting resistance that never came. They found broken weapons, shattered positions, and the bodies of men who had held long past any rational limit. Hill 205 was finally taken, but it did not feel like victory. The German unit had lost far more men than expected. The delay had cost them time they could not recover, and the ground they stood on felt cursed, soaked in effort, blood, and stubborn refusal. The hill had been held, not forever, not successfully, but long enough. And somewhere beyond Hill 205, American units advanced through positions that should have been reinforced, positions that were empty now because an enemy battalion had been forced to bleed itself dry, taking a rise in the ground that was not supposed to matter. The 23 Americans were gone, but what they had done remained. They had turned a number on a map into a line the enemy could not ignore. They had bought time with their lives. They had proven that even a forgotten hill could become a fortress if the men on it refused to leave. Hill 205 fell at last, but it was never truly taken. The battle for Hill 205 did not end when the firing stopped. In the hours after the Germans took the crest, confusion ruled the area. Units were reorganized, wounded were dragged downhill. Officers argued over maps and timetables that no longer matched reality. What was supposed to be a quick seizure had turned into a costly delay, and no one wanted to explain why so many men had been lost for a rise of ground that barely appeared on operational charts. German medics moved among the bodies. They found something unsettling. The Americans had not fallen in retreat. They had not clustered in one place or broken under pressure. They were scattered across the crest and slopes, in firing positions, behind makeshift cover, weapons still pointed downhill. Some had died with empty rifles, others with grenades in hand. The hill told a clear story to anyone who knew how to read it. These men had fought until there was nothing left to fight with. Orders came to move on quickly. The Germans did not linger. They marked the hill as secured and pushed forward, but the delay had already done its damage. Timetables slipped. Supporting units were out of position. American forces advancing elsewhere encountered weaker resistance than expected. A gap had opened, and it would widen by nightfall. That gap had been bought on Hill 205. Later that day, American troops reached the area. They approached cautiously, expecting resistance, only to find silence. Smoke still hung in the air. The ground was torn apart. Bodies lay where they had fallen, American and German mixed together in no clear line. It took only minutes to understand what had happened. Someone counted 23 Americans, no survivors. Word spread quickly through the unit. Men stood quietly, helmets off, staring at the slope. No speeches were given, none were needed. Every soldier there understood the cost written into the ground beneath their boots. Engineers later noted something else. German defensive plans in the sector had failed to account for the delay. Artillery support had arrived late. Reinforcements had been redirected too slowly. Hill 205, insignificant on paper, had disrupted an entire local operation. The platoon that held it was never reinforced, never relieved, never ordered to withdraw. They had simply been left, and they had stayed. When reports were written, the language was restrained. Position held under heavy enemy pressure. Unit destroyed. Enemy advance delayed. Clean words that could never fully capture what had happened on that slope. But among the men who read between the lines, the truth was clear. Hill 205 was not a mistake, it was a stand. The 23 Americans had done exactly what they were told. They had taken the hill, they had held it, and when holding it meant dying, they did not abandon it. Long after the battle moved on, Hill 205 remained quiet again. Grass would grow back, shell holes would soften, the number would stay on maps, meaningless to anyone who had not been there. But for those who knew, Hill 205 would always mean something else. It would mean the place where 23 men proved that even when forgotten, even when cut off, even when alone, a position could still be held, not by orders or reinforcements, but by resolve. They did not change the war, but they changed the day, and sometimes that is enough. In the days that followed, Hill 205 became a reference point no one wanted to linger on. American units advanced past it, using the ground the 23 had bought with their lives. Officers marked the hill on maps, not with celebration, but with a quiet understanding that something extraordinary had happened there. It was spoken about in briefings in careful language, then quickly moved past. The war did not allow time to dwell, but soldiers did. Men who passed the hill slowed without meaning to. Helmets came off, cigarettes were lit and forgotten. No one joked there. The slope felt different, Not haunted, but finished, as if it had already taken all it ever would. The platoon that relieved the sector found personal effects scattered among the positions. Letters folded carefully and tucked into pockets, photographs creased and stained, dog tags still around necks. These were not men caught by surprise. These were men who had expected to be there until the end. Graves were dug nearby, simple, shallow, marked hastily with what was available. There were no chaplains on hand, no ceremony beyond a few words spoken low and quickly. The front was still moving. Enemy artillery was still within range. Respect had to be efficient. That night, German artillery fired sporadically into the area, but no serious counterattack followed. Whatever Hill 205 had been meant to support was already gone. The delay had forced adjustments the Germans could not recover from. Units that should have met American advances were out of position or depleted. The cost of the hill was still being paid, just not by the men who had held it. Reports filtered upward through command channels. Maps were revised, timelines rewritten. In staff tents far from the smoke and noise, officers traced lines with pencils and acknowledged delays without naming their cause. Hill 205 became a footnote, but a significant one. For the soldiers who fought on, the story spread differently, not as strategy, not as analysis, as respect. The guys on that hill didn't fall back. They held it until there was nobody left. They knew what was coming. Those sentences traveled faster than any official report. In quiet moments, men wondered what they would have done in the same place, whether they would have stayed, whether they would have held. The answers were never spoken aloud because no one could be sure. Hill 205 asked questions that did not need answers. As the war continued and the front pushed east, the hill faded from immediate memory. New battles replaced old ones. New losses demanded attention. But something had been set there, a standard that could not be undone. The 23 Americans had not been heroes in the way posters depicted. They had not been photographed or interviewed. They had not lived to explain their choices. They had simply stayed. And in a war defined by movement, advances, retreats, breakthroughs, staying in one place until it was no longer possible became an act that other soldiers remembered. Hill 205 no longer mattered as ground. It mattered as proof. Time moved on, but Hill 205 stayed where it was. Weeks later, the fighting had shifted miles away. New objectives replaced old ones. Different hills were taken, lost, and taken again. On maps, Hill 205 was no longer circled or annotated. It was just another rise of ground passed over by supply columns and marching men. But among those who had seen it, the hill carried weight. Veterans spoke of it quietly, usually at night, usually after long days when exhaustion loosened tongues just enough. No one exaggerated, no one needed to. The facts were heavy enough on their own. 23 men. No relief, no withdrawal, no survivors. What struck people most was not how they died, but how long they stayed. Hill 205 had never been reinforced because command never expected it to hold that long. When it did, the assumption became dangerous. Orders were delayed. Decisions were made elsewhere. By the time anyone realized what was happening on that slope, the opportunity to change it was gone. The men on the hill had been fighting a different war than everyone else. While others maneuvered, they endured. While line shifted, they remained fixed. While command debated, they held. That contrast stayed with those who understood it. Later, when after-action reports were finalized, Hill 205 was described in measured language. Position contested heavily. Enemy advance delayed. Unit lost. The words were technically accurate and completely insufficient. What was missing was intent. The Americans on Hill 205 had not stayed because they were ordered to die. They stayed because the order they had been given, to hold, had never been revoked. In the absence of new instructions, they followed the last one they had received, fully aware of what it would cost. That mattered. It mattered because it revealed something fundamental about how wars are really fought, not only by plans and numbers, but by individuals making choices when communication fails and clarity disappears. Hill 205 became one of those places instructors mentioned in passing years later, not with fanfare, but with respect. A reminder that sometimes a position holds not because it is strong, but because the men on it decide it will not fall while they are alive. No monument marked the hill, no plaque explained what happened there. Grass grew back, craters softened, the land healed in ways people could not. Yet for those who knew the story, Hill 205 was never empty ground. It was the place where discipline outlasted reason, where duty survived isolation, where 23 Americans answered silence with resolve. And long after the guns moved on, that answer remained, written not in stone but in memory, as proof that even a forgotten hill can become a line no enemy passes without paying a price. Years later, Hill 205 did not appear in popular histories of the war. There were no dramatic photographs of the fight, no famous commanders associated with it, no single moment that could be reduced to a headline. What happened there resisted simplification, and history often favors what can be easily explained. But among soldiers and historians who looked closer, Hill 205 became something else, a case study. It was cited quietly in staff colleges and training discussions, not as an example of tactical brilliance but of human limits under isolation. A platoon cut off, communication lost, no reinforcement, no withdrawal order. And still, the position held far longer than any planner would have expected. The question instructors asked was never why the hill was taken, it was why it held so long. The answer always came back to the same point: discipline without supervision. The men on Hill 205 did not fight because someone was watching. They fought because the last clear order they received still made sense to them, and because abandoning it felt worse than staying. That distinction mattered. In war, confusion is often more dangerous than firepower. Units break not only because they are overwhelmed, but because they no longer know what is expected of them. On Hill 205, expectation never changed. Hold the hill. Nothing replaced that order, so it remained absolute. For veterans who heard the story, that clarity was haunting. Many admitted they did not know what they would have done in the same position, how long they would have stayed without contact, at what point survival would outweigh duty. Hill 205 did not offer answers. It forced uncomfortable questions. Families of the fallen were told only fragments. Your son's unit was engaged heavily. He did his duty. He was part of a delaying action. True statements, incomplete ones. What those families never fully knew was how deliberate their son's final hours had been, that these men were not surprised or confused at the end, that they understood their situation and chose consciously to remain where they were. That knowledge stayed mostly with those who found the hill afterward. Years passed, veterans aged, stories were told less often than only when asked. Hill 205 slipped further into the background of a war filled with names everyone recognized. But among those who understood the weight of small unit combat, it never disappeared. It stood as proof that courage does not always announce itself, that sacrifice is often quiet and unrecorded, that sometimes the most decisive actions happen when no one is watching. The 23 Americans did not change the direction of the war, but they shaped the moment they were given. They held a place that was never meant to hold. They delayed an enemy that was never meant to be delayed. They stood fast when everything around them suggested they had already been forgotten. Hill 205 remained where it always had been, a rise of ground with no marker, no monument, no explanation. But for those who knew the story, it was never just a hill. It was the place where 23 men answered uncertainty with resolve, and proved that even silence can be met with defiance. In the end, Hill 205 was never remembered for where it was. It was remembered for what happened when nothing else arrived. No reinforcements, no radio calls, no final order to withdraw, just silence, and a decision that had to be made again and again as the hours passed. The 23 Americans who held that hill were not acting on heroism in the way stories often describe it. They were acting on clarity. They had been given a task, and in the absence of anything that changed it, they carried it out to its conclusion. Not because it was glorious, not because it was expected to be remembered, but because it was theirs. Hill 205 did not fall quickly. It did not fall easily. It fell only after it had taken everything the men on it could give. When the Germans finally stood on the crest, they did not find a broken unit or a panicked retreat. They found the remains of a defense that had been deliberate to the last moment. That mattered. It mattered because time was the currency of war, and Hill 205 bought it at the highest possible price. Elsewhere, American units advanced through positions that should have been defended, lines held that should have bent. Plans stayed intact because somewhere an enemy force had been forced to stop, regroup, and bleed for ground that was never supposed to slow them down. The men on Hill 205 never saw the result of what they had done. They never knew that their stand had altered the rhythm of the day. They never heard the reports that followed. They never saw the ground taken behind them because the enemy had stalled in front of them. But that is how most real sacrifices work. They are not witnessed by those who make them. They are felt by those who come after. Hill 205 returned to silence after the war. The ground healed. Grass covered craters. Weather erased the scars in ways it never could erase memory. There was no monument raised high enough to draw attention, no marker explaining what had happened on that slope, and yet the hill endured, not as terrain, but as a standard. A reminder that even in a war defined by movement, there are moments when holding matters more than advancing, that even when communication fails and plans collapse, individual resolve can still shape events far beyond its immediate reach. The 23 Americans who held Hill 205 did not ask to become an example. They became one by staying. They stayed when it would have been easier to fall back. They stayed when it became clear no one was coming. They stayed until staying was no longer possible. In doing so, they turned an unnamed rise of ground into something permanent. Hill 205 was not important because of its height. It was important because of the men who refused to leave it. And as long as stories like theirs are told, the hill will never truly be empty, because it will always stand as proof that sometimes the strongest line in war is not drawn on a map, but held by those who decide it will not break.